coming. So the Peconic bay scallop is my subject. It is a beautiful, beautiful creature, and not just to people who want to eat it. It's gender neutral. It has everything it needs to reproduce between those delicate waffly shells. It is an actual hermaphrodite. Adults are 2 to 3 inches across. They have a delicious adductor muscle, which I'll show you later, and 70 blue eyes arranged like sapphires along the edge of the shell, adjacent to a lacy set of cilia, those little feathery things, those are its cilia, and it uses those to create a constant flow of water and plankton into its body. The plankton are its food. The bay scallop's 2-year lifespan winds down a few months after it reproduces, and that's when we eat them. There are about 300 species of wild scallops in the world. Some of them, like the weather vane, which is an Alaska scallop, is the size of a dinner plate. Believe it or not. Can you imagine the size of a dinner plate? Well, I don't even know what I would do with a scallop that size. I guess I'd figure it out. Some of them are tiny, less than an inch, hardly worth shucking. But the wild bay scallop species of the Peconic estuary is Argopecten irradians, and the range of that particular scallop, which is our local scallop, extends from New England to North Carolina. Well, it used to extend from New England to North Carolina. It's now really just found in this area. Although the same species, Argopecten irradians, is farmed in China and Korea. And I can talk more about that later if you're interested in it. The habitat of the scallop is the Peconic estuary, the east end of Long Island. The landscape is hills, bays, creeks, which I know I'm supposed to pronounce crick, and enormous boulders left behind when the glaciers of the last ice age receded. The bottoms of the harbors and cricks, crick is actually a narrow tidal inlet, are covered in grass, in sand, or in mud, depending on where you are. And the organic and the mineral compounds of the bay bottom are in the body of the bay scallop. The bay scallop is a filter feeder. So what's on the bottom, what's in the water, that's what's in its body. And it ingests particles of its environment, and that affects its flavor when we eat it. So a naturalist named Ernest Ingersoll in 1886 wrote a wonderful article called The Scallop and Its Fishery, and it's still, to this day, I think the best description of the Peconic scallop's home, of its territory. The proper home of this species, he wrote, seems to be in fairly deep water on a firm bottom, either sand or tough mud, yet in many localities grassy beds are resorted to by it. And it resorts to grassy beds when they're little. Basically, when a scallop is less than a year old or even younger, it's referred to as a bug. It's a tiny little thing, and at that point they like to hang out in grass because grass protects them. Underwater grass we're talking about. Grass protects them from the whelks and the starfish that would eat them. Ingersoll also wrote about the earliest explorers of North America and their observation that Native Americans ate a variety of shellfish, including bay scallops. They left large shell heaps as evidence of this, and the area around Fresh Pond, actually here on Shelter Island, is one of the places where archaeologists have found huge quantities of bay scallop in middens. Middens are the sort of garbage dumps of our Native Americans as far back as 10,000 years, so we're talking way back. And one of the fascinating things to me is that the fact that they found so many scallop shells in these dwelling sites is evidence that Shelter Island previously they thought that Native Americans used Shelter Island primarily as a summer location. They would camp here in the summer, but their main domicile was elsewhere. But this proved that these were year-round. They were living here year-round. They were not coming across from Connecticut or from other islands. This was a year-round place for them, and that settlement was very established by Native Americans for thousands of years. which I think is a very interesting fact. They have an enormous adductor muscle. That white thing is the adductor muscle. That's the muscle that opens and closes the shells. And compared to, say, an oyster, that is a very, very large muscle. When you eat an oyster, you're eating mainly guts. When you eat a scallop, well, in the United States, we only eat the adductor muscle. We only eat the white part. We don't eat the rest of it, although the rest of it is perfectly edible. And in Europe, they do eat, for the varieties of scallops that they have in Europe, they do eat the entire creature, including, you know what, it's delicious. Believe it or not, I've eaten it, it's delicious. But anyway, I won't, you know, that's fine. So anyway, this is a mature scallop with a highly edible white adductor muscle. Scallops are very athletic. They move. They clap their shells, and that's why this adductor muscle is so large, and that's why the flesh of the adductor muscle is good to eat. It's fairly firm. They're quite athletic. They clap their shells together. The valves shoot jets of water, propels them to safety. They also can orient themselves in the water to get a better flow of the water over their cilia, and also to adjust what they feed on. So they actually can make choices about what they eat, which I think is really interesting. Unlike an oyster or a clam, they can move around. They can go to, you know, places that they like better, to the extent that they can make choices. They do. I'm not saying they're geniuses. I'm just saying, you know, they have some abilities here. Yeah. You know. So there was a chef, Sanford D'Amato, who wrote a wonderful memoir about his career, and in it he described the first time he ever tasted a Peconic Bay scallop, which happened after he'd moved to a restaurant out on the East End and was working there, and he said, the best way to describe the natural sweetness is a lush, briny candy. They didn't need any cooking. You could pop them in your mouth. When they were quickly cooked through, it only took one bite to understand the fanatical devotion to bay scallops in this area. So I want to talk a little bit about this amazing taste, and I know that a lot of you have, probably all of you have eaten many Peconic Bay scallops, but it's a very different thing, and I think it's one of the wonderful things about living out here, that we get to eat this incredible food that I think is so different and so much better than any other kind of scallop you can get. So that's what really motivated me to find out more about where this flavor comes from. So there are several factors that affect the taste of the Peconic Bay scallop. So first of all, these scallops live in brackish waters. The water is only slightly less salty than seawater. It's 27 to 31 parts per thousand salinity. Seawater is in the low 30s, so it's less saline than seawater, slightly less, but not a lot less. And like many sea animals, scallops produce amino acids that help them tolerate high concentrations of salt in the seawater. The concentration of salt in the seawater is higher than the salt in the cells in their body, so they have to produce amino acids in order to live in salty conditions, otherwise their cells would weep and they would die. So they produce these amino acids, and two of these amino acids in particular affect their flavor. One of them is called glutamate. Glutamate is what gives scallops their savory flavor, which is known as umami. So if you've ever eaten mushrooms or meat, and that umami is that rich sort of meaty, mushroomy taste. And scallops have that, and they get it from the glutamates that they produce, which is an amino acid. Glycine is the other amino acid that affects their taste, and that's what makes them taste sweet, very sweet. Unlike oysters, which can live in fairly low salinity. The oyster can live in 10 parts per thousand salinity. And has anyone heard of oysters being moved at the end to be finished in higher, saltier conditions? Well, that's because they're more flavorful in saltier conditions. So an oysters can't move on their own, you have to move them. But scallops can't live in low saline conditions. They can only live in very salty conditions. So they are sweet by default. They can't live in low salt conditions that would make them less flavorful. And so a scallop is by definition a sweet tasting creature. Scallops are filter feeders. They strain the seawater, and the seawater contains phytoplankton and microscopic plants like algae. And sometimes you'll notice that bay scallops have a coral color. I don't know if you can see in the slide that these do, and it's very frequently you'll see the scallops have a slight orangish tinge. That's from beta carotene that's associated with some of the algae that they eat. And beta carotene is a source of nutrition. It's also a source of flavor. So that's another aspect of scallop flavor that's important to consider. And then the final one is something called bromophenols. Bromophenols are compounds that contribute something called the taste of the sea to wild seafood. So if you've ever noticed the difference between something wild caught and something farmed, the difference is bromophenols. Bromophenols are, they're sort of aromatic, they go away after a certain period of time. An animal has to have been feeding on the phytoplankton recently in order to have them. And so wild scallops have plenty of bromophenols, and that's part of their flavor. The varieties of plankton that create these bromophenols can change from one bay to the other, and so the ones in Peconic Bay have bromophenols associated with the local plankton, and they're pretty darn tasty. In addition to plankton in the water, scientists think that bay scallops eat organic matter from the slipper shells. Can you see those little critters that are on top of the scallops? Those are slipper shells, and they also create algae. They have an algae associated with them, which the scallops eat, and the scallops also eat algae that they've produced on their own shells. So scallops have a very, very rich diet, and it all contributes to their wonderful taste. So let me talk a little bit about spawning. I know it's mixed company. Right now, in the Peconic Estuary, spawning is over. Well, scallop spawning is over. I don't know what the other critters are doing, but the scallop spawning is over. And the adults are preparing for a very short retirement before they die of natural causes this winter. When you're a scallop, you only go around once, and so this is it for the adults. In addition to the amino acids, another source of the very sweet flavor in scallops are the simple sugars that result from glycogen breakdown. And unlike animals that store fat, mollusks store their energy in glycogen, especially in the adductor muscle and the digestive gland, until it is needed for spawning. So by the end of the summer months, the glycogen that the scallop used up spawning is restored. That's one of the reasons why if you eat a scallop after, March or April, you're eating, well, first of all, it's illegal, but second of all, you're eating a scallop that is not at its prime. It has expelled, its glycogen is all going to its gonads. See this scallop on the left? That's a May scallop. That's being held by a guy this is Stephen Tettelbach. He does a survey. He's throwing that one back. It's preparing to spawn, and you can see that its gonads are black. You do not want to eat that scallop, even if it were legal. The one on the right, this is a November scallop. It has spawned. It would have died very soon. It is sweet, it is legal, and I can tell you that it was delicious because I ate it immediately after photographing it. Guts and all. All right, so the question of mud. I don't even know if I should get into this, but I'm going to go ahead. So the vexed question of mud. So one of the things I'm often asked, and one of the things I've heard a lot of speculation about, is the question of whether scallops that are taken on mud taste better than scallops that live on sandy or so-called hard bottoms. And there are baymen present, so if you have an opinion, I would be happy to hear your opinion. All I can do is report what I have learned. It's hearsay basically. Although I do have one bit of scientific information. So basically, Charlie Manwaring runs Southold Fish Market. He talks to a lot of baymen. He said some guys say they can tell the difference. They can tell the difference between a scallop, an Orient scallop, and one from elsewhere. They think the Orient scallops taste better. He has also said that some taste the difference between scallops found on mud versus sand. Commander Cody, Jim Hayward told me that definitely mud is better. Everything tastes better on mud. And also in the oyster world, there's a perception that oysters taken on mud taste better, So I talked to Stephen Tettleback about this. He's the expert on scallop biology, and he said that they definitely will eat organic aggregates, which are basically organic matter that's held together by kind of mucus, which is food that they get from a muddy bottom, and they eat a lot of it. So we know they eat it, we know that they, we know they ingest the mud, and we know they taste good. As to whether they taste better than the ones that are on sand, I think they do, but it's not like they're labeling them in the fish store. So I don't know. Although you know what they do for oysters. So whoever's marketing scallops might keep that in mind, that it could be a way of selling more scallops, especially if we have to sell them at $40 a pound. All right, so a little scallop history. The Long Island Railroad opened the east end to the New York City's scallop supply chain in 1884, and this is when scallop fishing became a really important part of the East End economy. This is an invoice that's at the Shelter Island Historical Society, and it documents the sale of 23 pounds of scallops to John Elsey, who was a New York seafood distributor, and they were sold to him by Charles Congdon. They were sold 5 months after the Long Island Railroad linked New York City to Greenport in July of 1884, and it marks the beginning of commercial scalloping. So all of a sudden, it was possible in one day to get scallops from Shelter Island to New York City, or from Southold to New York City, and it opened up the New York City market to scallops, because scallops, unlike oysters, are open. When you take them out of the water, they don't close their shells. You have to shuck and eat them quickly. And so there was no way to get them. You can't, you have to either eat them, freeze them, or throw them away. So this was a big deal. This made commercial scalloping possible, really. All right, I think this is most people here probably know this, but I'll just go over this for those of you who haven't actually seen this in action. Scallops are taken with dredges. A dredge is basically an iron frame with a bag attached that the scalloper drags along the bottom of the bay from an open boat. The lower edge of the dredge is on the bottom. It hits the scallop, it pops the scallop, well actually the current pops the scallop into the bag. The bayman pulls the dredge up with the scallops in it, and usually there's a lot of other stuff in there too. So you have your color going through and sorting it all out for you. Or maybe you are your own color, in which case you sort it out. Most of the scallop dredges that are still in use out here were made by Paul Nosalik, who is known as Paul the Blacksmith. He retired in the late 80s, but he'd been making dredges for 60 years when he retired. He made them by hand out of his blacksmith shop. That's a picture of his that's him in his blacksmith shop. This was right behind, where Aldo's is now in Greenport. That's where the shop was. And there is a structure there that's called like Ye Olde Blacksmith Shop or something, but it's not the same building, but it's in the same place. And that's Paul Nosalik. And Keith Clark remembers visiting Paul the Blacksmith, and he told me that his fingers were black, there was soft coal all around the shop up to your knees, and you came out of there smelling like a smoked eel. in these photos, these other two photos, you can see Nosalik's dredges in use. That middle one is from the 50s, and you see those dredges? And that one on the right is from 2013. That's one of Keith Clark's dredges. And I think there are people in this room who still have Nosalik dredges, aren't there? Well, anyway, there are plenty of them around, and if you come down to Condon Creek on November, all of them, right? Yeah, they're the best. So scalloping was done from sailboats until the 50s. It was illegal actually to use a motor until the 50s. And they used a type of sloop called a catboat. That was sort of the vessel of choice. The mast is very close to the bow, just a mainsail, and they were the perfect platform for work. They didn't draw much water. You could nose them right up on the shore and offload your scallops onto the beach and open them right on the beach. And this is a photograph. This is also in the Historical Society of Alfred Tuttle scalloping and this was in 1949. The motorboats came in the 50s. So scalloping was, for many, many decades, a really big deal out here economically. It was, when Hoot Sherman was town supervisor in the 70s, he said that for the first few weeks after opening day, there was no one available to work the ferry. People disappeared from school to help their parents. It was all hands on deck. Rolly Clark said that scallops were everywhere, and on Shelter Island, people would say it smells like scallop season around here. It was literally in the air. There were so many of them, they canned them, which I have to say, I think is the most disgusting thing I've ever heard of. I don't know, I guess there were a lot of them, but I don't think I would want to eat that. That's also in the Historical Society. There are no scallops in it. Just in case you're wondering, it's empty. That would be really, really disgusting. All right, so opening day was and is a really big deal on Shelter Island. This year it's November 6th. It's the first Monday in November. This is a photograph from 2014. This is John and Nancy Catula on their boat. It's a really important day. It's a tradition to go out. They will go out with a relative, with fathers and sons, husbands and wives, with daughters. It's a wonderful tradition. You go out at sunrise. The first dredge can go in the water at sunrise on that morning, and as you can see, they were up well before dawn, loading up, and I think they were the first ones out that morning that I saw, although there might have been someone before them. These are the Clarks, I think. They're leaving from the Clarks dock, also Conklin Creek, and it was just before dawn. They probably got out there just when the sun came up.
That's nice.
What's that?
That's our boat.
That's your boat.
That's our boat.
Oh, that's you. Oh, great. Oh, yes, there you are. Yeah. Husbands and wives. Excellent. Yes, you told me how to freeze them. That's very useful information. Did you know you have to separate them to freeze them? Very important. I didn't know that. That was the key. That was the key. They actually freeze really well. Yeah. All right. And there's father and daughter heading out. Jim Hayward's back there behind the, let's see, Skip Tuttle remembered that you could take 10 bushels a day, every day, for the whole season, from the 1930s until 1985, and many did. The price, when he was most active, was about 25 cents a pound. And when he was 14 years old, that's when he was 14 years old, and he said if the price went up a nickel, it was the talk of the town. Yeah, that's changed. This is John Field unloading. That day he was out at 7, he was out by 7, back by 11. This is opening day again, with his limit. That was last year, I guess, and it was a good year. Opening them is extremely important. It's all hands on deck because it has to be done immediately. And the top picture is, I am 90% sure that structure has now been removed, because when I went back to look for it, I couldn't find it. There used to be scallop shacks like that all over Shelter Island. And they're mostly gone. I actually don't know of another one, and I'm afraid that one has now been removed also. So that's the way scallops used to be opened, in an open air shack. People would go and open until they were all gone, because you had to do it right away. Nowadays, people have, this is Louise and Keith Clark in their basement. They have a scallop opening facility and many Baymen do. In their home, and the DEC comes and inspects it, and it's sanitary and whatnot. And so this is the way that it's done now. Or fishermen will just take them to sell in the shell on the day that they get them. Well, this is the sad part. Until 1985, it was, there were actually the early 80s were the largest scallop harvests in the history of the East End. And then in 1985, a devastating brown tide, which is an algae bloom fueled by water pollution, essentially wiped out the Peconic Bay scallop population. Stevie Lennox remembered going out that year. He was with his brother. Everybody went out, on opening day to throw out the first dredge of the year. And it was his brother's 50th birthday, and he said we went out and everything was dead. Everything except the hard clams was gone. Brown algae had killed everything. Brown algae is particularly lethal to scallops because it paralyzes their cilia. They can actually metabolize. They can eat brown algae, but they starve to death because it paralyzes their basically it paralyzes their digestive system, their cilia. So it's lethal, and so that killed off the scallops. But there were as you can see by the graph, it went way down, and then there was a second brown tide in 1995, and that really caused a near extinction of the Peconic Bay scallop. They became one of the disappearing foods brought aboard the Ark of Taste, which is the Slow Food Organization has something called the Ark of Taste. It's an international organization. It was just a recognition of the seriousness of the situation. It was essentially, it's like an endangered species list for foods, and there was international concern about this. This was also when the annual Lions Club Scallop Dinner started serving frozen farmed scallops from Peru or China because they could not get local scallops anymore. The scallop farming organizations, companies that wanted to farm had visited the East End of Long Island and had taken Peconic Bay scallop spats to their farm, to farm with. So that's the species that they farm with, but they're not, for a variety of reasons, they don't taste as good. But there were no more local scallops for a while, or very few. And one year, I think the worst year, there were 53 pounds total harvested. Yeah, really bad. So then, in 2006, a reseeding program headed by Stephen Tettelbach, who's a biologist at Long Island University, began to support the wild bay scallop population by planting millions of larval scallops in the Peconic estuary. By 2008, they started to see population gains, and those gains have been sustained in the years since. In 2014, Bayman harvested 85,000 pounds of scallops. That's 30 times higher than the annual average landings for the 12 years prior to that, prior to when the restoration began. So that's better. It's a lot better. There was a sharp increase in 2015 and 16, but the harvests are still not back to where they were in the early 80s. We're not back to where in the early 80s when there were just tons of them. But it's getting better. And so the question is now what's coming up. Oh, I do want to say one thing about that I think is interesting, having to do with the shells. So the color of a bay scallop shell is a hereditary thing. It's like the color of someone's hair. It's not really related to what they're eating. It's more related to their genetics. Mm-hmm. And the striped shell, see the ones that have striped shells? Mm-hmm. Those are called skunks. And they're yeah, I know, appropriate. And they're actually very, very rare, or they were very, very rare in a natural setting. So one thing that the reseeding process, they decided to use skunk scallops, skunk bugs, in the reseeding as a way of trying to evaluate how the reseeding was working. So prior to the reseeding, you might see 1 in 1,000 scallops that was a skunk. And after the reseeding, it shot up. So this is just a way, it was a way, and it continued to grow geometrically. So now, it's not that uncommon to see skunk scallops, and it used to be very, very rare. So that's actually a sign that the reseeding is working, and it's a positive thing, and it's fine to eat them as long as they're big enough. The choicest scallops, according to James Beard in the Fireside Cookbook, are the small bay scallops about 1/2 inch thick and pinkish white. And so that's one culinary authority. There's another culinary authority. When they're not quite done, they're done. And I am done. Thank you. Sure, if anybody has any questions. Yeah, I do.
Jody, a very long time ago, I had a house in the Springs, and it was on Gardiner's Bay, and after a storm, I remember one time there was seaweed all over it. In that seaweed, there were thousands of scallops going like this. Has that ever happened on Shelter Island?
Yes.
Ah.
Yes, in fact, does anyone here remember the storms when
Yeah.
I don't, but can you?
No, I was just thinking about hurricane, but I was remember one storm, I'll never forget, looking on the beach and it was all full of scallops.
Yeah.
That's what I was,
Yeah.
remember that storm? I can't remember which one it was. I
Yeah,
just remember.
they actually are, I mean, it's very interesting. They definitely get involved in sort of mass events where they get washed up. And I've heard stories of a storm, and I don't remember the year, but these are all pre-85, of a storm where there were so many, I think it was Hay Beach, that, everybody in town was down there, and they were just trying to open them, before
Maybe
they.
it was the same storm.
It could have been, yeah.
Can you talk a little bit about the brown tide? It began, as I gather, in the mid-80s. Is it continuing, and what are the efforts being taken to ameliorate it?
Yeah, so there are several different algae blooms that are harmful. The brown tide is the one that is most harmful to scallops because it paralyzes their cilia. Red tides are not great for them, but they're not as bad as the brown tide. There've really only been two on the east end, in Peconic, in the scalloping areas. There was the brown tide of '85, and then the other one in the early '90s, or maybe it was '95. Those were terrible events that killed a lot of scallops. This year, there was a brown tide event in Shinnecock, I think, in the summer, and one other place, but neither of those are really scalloping areas anymore. So every summer you'll hear about algae blooms, and they tend to get mixed together. The brown tide is the one that is most lethal to scallops. The red tide is not great for them. The rust tide is not great for them. There was rust tide this summer in Chase Creek, and all other rust tides were everywhere this summer. It was a really bad year for the tides. So, but the brown tide is the one that is most lethal, and they're all caused by the same thing. It's pollution from nitrates, and it's because on the east end of Long Island, for the most part, we are all on septic systems. That's where it comes from. Anybody who tries to tell you it's golf courses, it's not mainly golf courses. It's mainly septic systems. Yeah.
Are the scallop dredges made commercially now, or are you still go find a blacksmith?
You can buy. No, you can't get them from Paul the blacksmith anymore. Hey, you know what? I don't know. Where do you buy a new? Does anybody buy new dredges?
Welding builds them.
They do build them.
And this, Sable Net and Twine also has them.
My father collected scallops from Shinnecock Bay.
Oh, really?
He used the look box because he was collecting them one by one.
Oh, he was doing. These were sea scallops or bay scallops?
These are bay scallops.
Oh, okay.
And he was also a member of the Rotary, and he couldn't understand why people didn't eat the entire scallop, since we do that with clams and mussels and oysters and every
Yeah.
other thing we did.
He's right.
So he set up, I don't have the recipe, but he set up a meal for the Rotarians and he fed them the whole scallop and they ate it.
And I mean, they are delicious. You know, they've had, so Greg Rivara, I think, is the guy who, was involved with trying to get some scallop farming going on the East End. And, you know, the thing about scallop farming is that scallops do not like to be farmed. They do not want to be close to other scallops. They do not do well. And so when you farm them, you get really teeny tiny, you get small scallops, right? But since you're farming them, you don't have to worry about whether they're legal or not. They're, you know, but they steam them whole because they're not big. They're not really big enough to shuck and eat the adductor. So if you can find the farmed ones, and they're hard to find, you would eat them whole. You eat them whole.
Yeah.
You eat the whole thing. Yeah.
Jerry, two questions. When they reseeded with the bugs, I understand that they used the bugs from like the Carolinas or the Chesapeake, and no,
I don't think so.
they taste different than they did before the reseeding.
There's a different species. They used Argopectin irradians, and the range of that scallop is New England. Well, it was down to North Carolina. Now it's so when the reseeding happened, they were using local scallops.
So there's no taste difference between the pre-bugged ones and the ones
Between the what?
pre-bugged and reseeded.
So, you know, the way that reseeding works is, well, so first of all, a scallop only lives 2 years, right? So, the reseeding ones, you're probably not even, most people, we're not really eating those, we're eating descendants of those. And they did use Argopectin irradians.
Okay, and the second question.
And they farm those, they raise those, you know, they raise them to spat form, and then they take them out and throw them into, you know, the good scalloping spots.
That's good to know. Second question is that when I see all these baymen picking all the scallops, you know, in the season, they look like they're just in the water to me. It doesn't look like brackish at all. I mean, you know, I know these waters fairly well. I mean, I don't see where the brackish quality would come from, where the fresh water would be diluted from. They look like they're just out in the bay.
Believe it or not, the water in the Peconic Estuary is less salty than seawater, just a little bit. So seawater is low 30s salinity, and if you look, you can actually look at. It's very interesting to look at maps of. You can look at salinity maps. It'll tell you exactly what the salinity is, and they measure it constantly. So it ranges. I mean, scallops can only live in 27 to 31. If it's saltier than 31, they die, and if it's less salty than 27, they die. So that's it. They will only live in those conditions, and that's slightly less salty than seawater, but it's saltier than like Gulf of Mexico water. So it's considered brackish. Brackish just means anything that's slightly less salty than. And there is some fresh water coming in. You know, I mean, we don't have a lot of rivers. I guess there's the Peconic River, but there is fresh water coming in. Yeah.
Me?
Yes.
Well, this morning we signed up for the Lions Club.
Very good. Me too.
That's how we heard about you and decided to come tonight and be pre-educated to know what we're having. But however, you mentioned that are scallops coming from Peru, or are they?
Well, I don't know where they're getting them this year. I don't know. They may have frozen Peconic-based scallops, but see okay, so this is actually very interesting. The Lions Club has always had the dinner on Columbus Day weekend, always. It's been going for over 50 years, I think a lot more than 50 years. And they, up until I guess 87 or 6, scallop season opened in September. So they were able to serve local scallops. And then after 85, the DEC pushed back opening day to November. So it went from September to November after Columbus Day weekend. The Lions Club decided to keep the event on Columbus Day weekend and basically get scallops from elsewhere. They're bay scallops, but they are not Peconic-based scallops. And they may have Peconic-based scallops this year if they got them frozen. So, can I just tell you that they will be delicious? There are many things that affect scallop flavor, after, after they come out of the water, and, I'm sure they'll have very high quality ones. So for instance, has anyone ever seen scallops bay scallops in a store that have sort of a milky
Yes,
milky
they're
stuff?
awful.
Do
the
not buy
Peruvians.
those.
They're horrible.
They've been, it's what's called salting, although it's
Yeah.
not salt. They put a preservative on them, it's a chemical
Yeah.
that keeps them plump and moist. So do not ever buy those, they are terrible, they will never brown, you will never
No.
get them brown.
And they
no matter
disintegrate too,
how-
you get half the amount that you ordered,
And
yeah.
they have a chemical,
shrink.
they have a detectable chemical taste,
Peruvians
yeah.
could
So
tell
they
them.
will not have those.
No, they're not gonna have those, no.
Peruvians, as long as they freeze them immediately and they're farmed, so they won't have bromophenols, but they'll be quite tasty. Yeah.
How do scallops reproduce? Do they get together and go like this?
No, they don't. They are hermaphrodites. They spew out some of this and they spew out some of that, and it all mixes up, and baby scallops appear. It's magic.
They like to keep it simple.
Yeah,
Are scallops found in the bays or in the creeks around?
both. Yeah,
And when they go dredging, they go out in the middle of the bay and they just drag this thing along?
they sure do.
And they're all over, or they're in certain hot spots?
Well,
they all have their hot spots.
yeah.
They're not gonna tell you.
Yeah, there's a whole science to that, or an art, I guess I should say, yeah.
They're not all,
Keep on looking.
you gotta keep looking.
Yeah, they're definitely, yeah.
Charity, thank you. First of all,
Just
you're
as they were
extremely
much more
knowledgeable, and I love your sense of humor.
Oh, thank you.
What
I
can we
used to get
do
it when I
as
was a kid.
citizen of
But
Shelter
that was
Island
like
to bring back
50 years
the
ago.
Well,
We
you
have
can
a lot.
support
Or more.
clean water efforts. That's very, very important. That's really the most important thing. I think, a lot of people have sort of sticker shock when it comes to scallops, and they think, oh my gosh, they're so expensive. Well, they should be. They're very difficult to get. It's difficult to get wild scallops, but they are totally worth it. And so I think supporting the scallop fishery, I personally eat a lot of scallops. I've found ways of stretching stretching them, but I think clean water efforts are really the key,
Did you suggest that the nutrients that cause the brown tides come from septic tanks?
Mhm.
Is that so basically cesspools of leaching, water leaching into the bay from on land?
Yeah, so basically these algae blooms are caused by nitrates and phosphorus that get into the water. And it comes from the aquifer, and it comes from just water, groundwater and water coming in from the land. What they've done is they've actually, and this is fairly recent, and John Cronin has a wonderful presentation that he does on this. They can identify the sources of the phosphorus and the nitrates. In other words, they can tell how much of it, what percentage of it comes from, say, farming, fertilizer, or from golf courses, the types of fertilizers used, or from septic. They can analyze that, and so there are pie charts. You can find these online that will tell you what percentage of the waters immediately around Shelter Island, for instance, what percentage of the nitrates and phosphates in Congdon Creek, for instance, or Cockles Harbor, which is ground zero for. That's the best, probably one of the best scalloping areas in the world. Exactly where where those nitrates and phosphates are coming from, what percentage is farming and what percentage is golf courses and what percentage is septic. And the thing is, the eastern end of Long Island, or actually all of Suffolk County, is very unusual in this country in that if you don't live in Riverhead or a town, you are on a septic system. That's just the way it is. We don't have, and even in the Heights and in other areas of Shelter Island where we have a septic system, we don't treat what comes out. We gather it all together, but we don't treat it to the extent that these new systems do to reduce the nitrates. So Sylvester Manor has one of these systems that treats the nitrates, treats for nitrates to an acceptable level, and produces basically water that you can water your garden with. And that's about it. Now, there's some legislation now, that's, I think it will require, somebody correct me on this if I'm wrong, I think it will require new construction to put in the, septic systems that do treat for nitrates. Am I right about that? Does anybody-
Yeah, we're working on that.
But that's new construction only, that doesn't grandfather any of the old ones. And, I guess there's some talk about, encouraging people when they renovate, if they do a certain amount of renovation, to put in one of the new systems, because the new systems cost, I think, around $12,000-13,000, and an old septic system is more like, I don't know, a few thousand, 5,000 maybe. So it's a big, it's a big.
But there's also a maintenance fee involved, but every year or two you have to maintain it, which is quite expensive.
Yeah.
It's like at least minimum 5, some people, you have to,
Yeah.
they're not
No,
cheap,
it's
you know?
not cheap, that's right, that's right. That's right. Yeah,
Showed on your graph there, 1985, that's when the Scallop started to decline.
yeah,
Does anybody know why?
that was the brown tide year.
Yeah, but does anybody know what caused it?
Oh, you mean why the brown tide was so bad that year?
I'm gonna tell you, in May of that year, that's when they started dumping treated sewage into
Oh, the
Peconic
Riverhead
Bay.
sewage.
Yeah, that's
You mean the
that, yeah.
Riverhead sewage
Mhm.
plant?
Right.
Yes, I've heard
And
that, yeah.
At the time, I knew a chiropractor over in East Hampton, and he flew up that area 2 weeks after they started dumping it into the bay, right? And he said you could see where there was a semicircle of brown. And a couple of weeks later, he flew back up there again, and now that semicircle of brown is almost to Robbins Island. And it's ever since then
Yep,
that we've
that's
had
true.
these problems.
Mm-hmm.
And yet, back in those days where I didn't know anything and still don't know anything about sewage treatment plants, except that what we learned back then was they can get away with building a 2-stage plant. But it should always be built as a 3-stage plant, because the 3rd stage, the water that's coming out of there, in theory, you can drink.
Yeah, no,
And
I
you're
think that's
dumping it
absolutely
in-
right.
In our bay, that's the way it should, but they didn't build the 3rd stage.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, no, that's right, it's not a
Yeah,
tertiary system.
that's actually very true though. I know my brother, I know a lot of fishermen, they all said the exact same thing, it all happened in Riverhead, started in Riverhead.
Recently,
Instead of blaming every little cesspool, it
Well,
happened very
yeah, I mean,
fast instead
that
of.
was the event that got people's
Yeah.
attention, but the continuing problem is, I mean, it's every single septic system, it's not.
Right, yeah, but I'm just saying that's, anyway, there's such a
Yeah.
correlation, so many of the fishermen have said the exact same thing, but what you just said about Riverhead, that's what they all said, the same, and it's funny, nobody would bring that up, but almost everyone the fishermen would all say the exact same thing, that's what happened to
Yeah, I've
Scallops.
heard that too.
You know,
Yeah.
well, whatever.
Yeah.
I don't think, okay.
You had mentioned the water, presentation that John Cronin had given. On October 14th, late afternoon, there's gonna be something that the Nature Conservancy is giving on water. And I think John Cronin, Mark Mobius from the Water Quality Improvement, Plan Advisory Board is gonna be speaking, as well as, Jeremy Samuelson, is that his last name? From the Nature Conservancy.
Mhm.
Yes, so I think the 3 of them will be talking on water.
Oh,
People want
great.
to learn more. And it's going to be at the school auditorium.
Oh, that's great.
I don't know the exact time, but it's late afternoon on the 14th,
Yeah,
which is Saturday.
yeah, I mean, and some of these questions, I think, actually would be great ones to ask. I mean, they would know. All right, thank you so much.
Summer or fall, I'm not
Did it work?
I think it did, I'm not sure, but you can double check, but I just turned it off or whatever, but you can see if it worked or not. Let's see. I mean, I don't know, maybe I thought maybe I should get closer or not, but I'm not sure.
Recorded it. Yay, okay, so now.
I hope the voice was on.
Okay, now